want to thank you all for joining us for our remote Earth Day celebration. We're so bummed we can't celebrate with you in person as we normally would have the opportunity to through our volunteer days and through our film series. But we are so pleased to partner with National Geographic again for the third year. We partnered with them for Free Solo and for the movie Jane. So this year we're partnered with Born Wild, and we're so honored to have Dr.Rae Wynn-Grant, who is featured in the film, joining us today to talk about her research. And I just want to share a little bit about Dr. Rae's impressive history. I am a huge fan. Her doctoral and postdoctoral work was focused on researching the ecological and social drivers around large carnivores in human landscapes. And she's a fellow with the National Geographic Society. And she also maintains a visiting science position at the American Museum of Natural History, and is also an adjunct faculty at Columbia University and Johns Hopkins University. So I don't know how you're able to juggle all that and a family. I'm curious to learn about how you are able to conduct your research among all of your other tasks. But we are so pleased to hear about your research, and I'll let you take it away. Again, a little housekeeping for those who joined us. Please join us in chat, the chat room, ask your questions and say hi to the group. And after Dr. Rae's presentation, we'll ask some questions from the chat room and have a dialogue afterwards. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the really kind words and that introduction. I am speaking to you guys from Washington, D.C., which is where I live right now. It's where National Geographic headquarters is. And I could talk about myself for hours and hours, but that's not what we're here for. So I actually put together some slides. It's just pictures, just to kind of give you guys even more visuals of some of the work I do. And that's going to be how I introduce myself. And then I'll put the pictures away so you can have my face again. And we can do a Q&A for as long as Adrian lets us. So yeah, once again, my name is Rae Wynn-Grant. I am a wildlife ecologist. I focus on large carnivores. So I primarily study the movement and behavior of large predators. Right now, most of my projects focus on bears in North America, but I have a long background in studying lions in East Africa and jaguars in South America. And here and there, I dabble with primate projects as well. I live in the East Coast, but most of my work is in the West. I should also mention that I am born and raised in California, so not anywhere close to where you all are based, but I was born in San Francisco and lived there for a long time, and was raised for many, many years in San Luis Obispo, California on the Central Coast. So that is my home state, and I miss it very much. I just want to introduce you guys just a little bit about me. So I study, like I said, the movement and behavior of large carnivores, and I use pretty much the same devices in all of my work. And this device was mentioned in Born Wild. So you may have heard me talk about a GPS collar that goes on bears. It's pretty similar to what we use on lions as well. So this photo is from my very first lion project when I was quite young. It's a radio collar that allows me to drive around and find where the lion is located. That no matter what animal it is, it allows me to understand which habitat they're using and which habitat they're avoiding, which might sound pretty basic, but it's actually really good information to understand the ecology of animals, especially animals like large carnivores living in spaces where there is human activity. Whether I'm working in parts of North America or parts of East Africa, a lot of my work is important to local communities. So I spend a lot of time listening to local community members about what it's like to live with wildlife, whether it's African pastoralists from Maasai tribes or Western cattle ranchers. It's pretty much the same issues. It's about space, it's about overlap in landscape, and it's about conservation competing with local livelihoods. Early in my career, I transitioned to bears, and this is a photo that I have from graduate school, and I use it just to explain that I wasn't always doing kind of fancy media work. This is me taking the rectal temperature of a bear, and that is the kind of thing that they reserve for the grad students to do. So whenever we trap bears, including in the documentary Born Wild, for any adult bear, we sedate them. So they're always tranquilized and sedated just for a short amount of time so that they're not stressed out or afraid or hurting us while we do some of our checkups. So this sedated bear, this is on the California-Nevada border. And this is a black bear, which is brown in color. In that part of the world, that's their morphology is like a cinnamon brown color. And she is getting her temperature taken from the back, and that was my job. Here's a better image of a GPS collar. They're kind of big and clunky, but they're very lightweight. So for a 300, 400, 500-pound bear, it's really not a big deal. This is a female bear in her hibernation den. So she's tranquilized. She's just taken a little nap. We cover her eyes to make sure that, since she's not fully knocked out, we just don't want her to feel any stress with people kind of milling around her. So her eyes are covered. She's slightly unconscious. And I went into her den to make sure that her GPS collar had enough batteries and also to count her little babies that were born while she hibernated. What I love about this bear den that I've been visiting a number of times is that this female has actually just dug it out herself, and it's very, very small. So it is just this perfectly bear-sized hole right under the root system of a tree and right next to the banks of a river. And it's not big enough for me to fit in there with her. It's just bear-sized and cub-sized. And so we weren't even able to pull her out all the way. So we actually did her checkup with her half of her body in there since she was so large. But in general, when you watch Born Wild, or if you were to tag along on any of my field work, this is a lot of what it looks like. Just doing a once or twice a year check on a bear to make sure that they're healthy, and if they have cubs and offspring, to make sure that they are healthy and, more importantly, surviving. Finding a female with 3 newborn cubs is so extremely exciting. But the goal is to find her again 6 months later with those same 3 cubs. Not 2 cubs, not 1 cub, not 0 cubs, but those same 3, and then finding her a year later with those same 3 cubs. As you'll hear me say in the documentary, healthy bears mean a healthy forest. So actually measuring the health of one single black bear is a great indicator that the ecosystem itself is healthy, that there's enough food resources, that the environment is doing really well to support the bear community. And, the very best part of doing all of this is the baby animals. So I do not recommend anybody ever hold or touch a wild animal. But if you are ever accompanying any official bear research, young cubs are too little to thermoregulate. So they cannot produce their own body heat yet. So for the 5 or 10 minutes that they're out of their den when we're giving them their checkup, they do not get administered any tranquilizer drugs. And they have to actually be stuffed into our shirts and into our jackets in order to stay warm while we do that before we put them back with the mother. So it is definitely the best type of science, I think, to do, because it is mandatory to cuddle sweet baby animals. So a lot of the work I do, again, is, finding wild animals, sedating them for a short time in order to collect data, and then releasing them and tracking them from afar. A GPS collar sends a signal to a satellite in outer space. That satellite sends a signal back to my computer that gives me a longitude and latitude point all the time. So although a lot of my pictures show very hands-on work with these animals, the idea is to be as non-invasive as possible. The idea is to be as hands-off as possible, for most of the year, and just gather the data in a non-invasive way to understand their movement and behavior. So most of the time I'm in Western areas. If you guys are Californians, you might notice this is Lake Tahoe. That's where I do a lot of my bear work, mostly on the Nevada side, and I'm usually as happy as I am in this picture, enjoying my life. Every so often I get the opportunity to try something new. And lately that has meant tropical ecosystems. So doing some wildlife work in the tropics. These photos come from Madagascar, from the rainforest in Madagascar, where I took a pause from doing terrestrial work and started going into the tree canopy, looking for arboreal species. So mainly we were in this rainforest looking to see if there was a population of lemurs that were not known to exist in this rainforest, and we found them. So it was a wonderful, wonderful bit of scientific discovery. So I'm very fortunate that every so often I'm able to really change things up and do a bit of non-carnivore science as well. And I see the questions popping up, so I don't have too many more slides. I'm going to pause now. I think I just added 1 or 2 more slides just in case I get a specific question. But I wanted to give you guys a sense of the fieldwork that I do that's sponsored by National Geographic and kind of bring you into my world a little bit. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see my face again, and then I'll have Adrian help me with some of the questions.
These photos are just so captivating. I find myself smiling ear to ear watching, especially the baby bears. How adorable.
If you want more baby bears, you got to watch the show because there is tons of content and it's pretty irresistible, I think.
It's a great teaser to get us to watch. I love that. We did have one question come in from the chat room about do mama bears use the same den year after year?
Yeah, it's a great question. In general, and you'll probably find this a lot with scientists, the answer is it depends. So sometimes yes, sometimes if she's lucky enough to get access to that same den year after year, then yes, absolutely she will. But it's not uncommon to see bears choose a new den. The great thing about bears is that they're huge and they're powerful and they have such large, strong bodies. It's very easy for them to create dens. Really, it just takes some digging and then takes some kind of padding and insulating. So it's not a super difficult thing for them to create a new den each year.
And I have a question too, is that what's the gestational period for a mama bear, and then how many litters or cubs may she have in her lifetime?
Sure. So these bears they usually mate at some point in the summer. And all female bears give birth in January. So we have this joke in the wildlife community that every bear you've ever seen or that's ever lived ever in North America was born in January. And that is likely true. So female bears give birth during hibernation in their den. And they will give birth every 2 years. So they will give birth 1 January to little tiny cubs. They will be with those cubs for a full year and then den with them again the second winter. And then it's when they emerge from the winter den in the spring, that second time, that the cubs will go on their way and they won't see their mother again. So bears are solitary species. They're not like lions that are in prides or wolves that are in packs. They're always by themselves. And so once the cubs have officially left the mother in that spring, she will be able to come into estrus again that summer. They live to be about 15 years old in the wild. They can live longer than that in captivity because they get everything they need. They get dentists and heart surgeons and all of that. And so if they're giving birth starting at age 3 or 4, every other year, they might have 5 or so litters in their lifetime.
That's interesting to hear they only live 15 years in the wild. I would have anticipated longer, but really interesting. What question from the group is, based on your research, how are bear populations doing in California?
Oh, sure. And that has little to do with my research. Actually, bears in California have been studied for a long, long time, since way before I got involved, about 10 or 12 years ago. And black bears, I will use black bears as an example. All the pictures you just saw were of black bears, even though they were different colors. Black bears are doing great all throughout North America. So they are certainly a conservation success story. We are often inundated with really bad news about wildlife species, and that does not apply to black bears. So a lot of conservation attention went into the black bear population about 30 or 40 years ago, and it's really, really worked. I'm sure I don't have to tell many of you guys that black bears are showing up on the edges of towns or, you know, in villages and eating out of garbage cans and whatnot. That isn't because they are being drawn out of the forest necessarily. It's because there's more black bears than there have been in the last 100 years or so. There's also more people in California than there have been in the last 100 years or so. So as the human population is increasing, so is the bear population. And it seems like we like a lot of the same habitats, if you will. But in terms of conservation in this country, black bears are not an endangered species. They are taken off of the endangered species list. Another great conservation success story is grizzly bears. They are not as abundant as black bears. You will only find grizzly bears in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and there's a couple in Washington State and Alaska. But that's it. And so there aren't many grizzly bears in our country, but they are on the rise. So every year there are more grizzly bears than the year before. So there's some really good conservation work being done there too.
I can only imagine the challenges of pulling a black mama bear out of her den to check her collar and do her measurements. Do you foresee that same type of research are you able to do that on grizzly bears? Or I imagine they're much bigger. Or how is your research on grizzly bears, if you do the research on grizzly bears, different than black bears?
Yeah, it is not very different. It's pretty much the same. Size is definitely an issue. You know, they're bigger animals, but actually the black bears that I study out west are very, very large bodied. So they can be, you know, up to 700 or 800 pounds. Whereas black bears out here in the east are usually much smaller. You know, they might be 200 or 300 pounds. So they're big animals. They're huge. I am not usually doing this work by myself. I usually have assistants or other team members or other biologists that I'm working with, at the minimum an assistant for myself. And it takes a lot of strength. We have to stay in good shape.
What are you hoping to learn? Specifically, are there any research questions you're answering by doing the black bear research?
Yeah, I love that question. So there are many, and I will give an example of one. So putting a GPS collar on a bear allows me to track its movements every couple of hours. So I get a whole bunch of data of where the bear is. And every couple of hours, a bear might be in the same spot it was before, or it might be somewhere miles and miles away. But basically, a lot of people might think that in one forest, a bear uses every square inch of the forest. But that's not necessarily true. So there's parts of the forest that they spend a lot of time in and parts of the forest that they avoid. To the naked eye, it might not seem like there's a difference between what's going on in the forest, but there is some kind of difference for that bear. And understanding that helps me understand the ecology of that animal. So one example is that bears in one area might never go farther than, 2 or 3 miles from a water source. That's really important to know. They might, prefer to stay in, a juniper grove of trees because they produce so many berries, and avoid pine trees because there aren't enough pine cones. Something like that is really important to know, not just for understanding the ecology of the animal, but also understanding what are the critical areas that need protection. If a state like California wants to build a hotel or a resort or make a highway somewhere, there might be parts of the forest where that's actually safe for wildlife and parts of the forest where it would be completely detrimental. So understanding those fine scale movements and what drives them is really important for promoting human-bear coexistence.
Oh, that's interesting, yes. I'm going to pivot to questions. I think it's interesting from the chat room is regarding your research in Madagascar with the lemur discovery. Did that lead to any protections for the lemurs then after that?
Yeah, great question. So lemurs are highly protected in Madagascar. They're a critically endangered species. There's only a couple thousand of them estimated to exist in the world. They're just in Madagascar. So finding them in a rainforest where it was not thought that they existed was a huge, huge, huge win, and immediately spurred some measure of protection. So again, because they're an endangered species, it really made it so that accessing that rainforest for things other than research was unavailable. So it was a really big win for the science world. I am happy to say that it wasn't a huge loss for the people living in that area. It was a rainforest that was not used very much by the local residents. So them losing access to that forest was not detrimental to their livelihoods. And that is always the best case scenario.
Absolutely. Well, would you like to continue sharing some slides, and then we can go back to some of the questions after your slides?
Okay, sure. Let me see what else I put on here.
Sure.
And I'll share my screen again. I might not have too many more. Oh, okay, that's it. I'm sorry, I will stop sharing, apparently.
Where is that picture taken there?
So I'll put it right back up, actually.
Gorgeous photos.
I love this photo. So where I'm standing in this photo is in Western Nevada. And the mountains that you see are the Sierra Nevada mountains. And so just over one of those mountains is Lake Tahoe. And so all of my work in the Lake Tahoe area has always been in the state of Nevada. For any of you who visited Tahoe, I would be very surprised if you ever went into Nevada, even though it's right, it's right there. But the Washoe Valley is what this area is called, and it's extremely wildlife abundant and very sparsely populated with people. So there's a big black bear population, big mountain lion population, lots of coyotes, lots of amazing large wildlife species, elk, and not a lot of people living there. There are some cattle ranches, but it is a very rural landscape, whereas 20 miles away, we have this big tourist attraction area. So it's an amazing place to do research. It's an amazing place to look at the dynamics of bears that live technically in close proximity to humans, but also in a pretty wild area.
And this picture really strikes me as an environment that is so diverse in its habitat types, from the grasslands you're walking in all the way up to the peaks of the mountains. When you radio collar the black bears and you can track their movements, do you find that bears are using sort of all parts of this range, or are they rather specialized, or do they avoid certain areas and prefer not to find themselves?
Yeah, great question. Certainly not. Certainly they don't use all of these areas. So, the Lake Tahoe area is a really rich, really amazing, not too dry area. But right in this valley, in the Washoe Valley, it's an extremely arid region. And most of Nevada, as I'm sure you guys know, is very arid, right? Very dry, almost desert-like. And that starts right here on the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, right in the Lake Tahoe Basin. So although there are bears here, they really, really congregate around permanent water sources, of which there are few. Also, we find that the bears don't prefer high elevations. So if you're looking at those mountains, you're not going to find black bears in the tops of these mountains. You might find other animals, you might find mountain lions, etc., but bears really prefer the foothills. They prefer lower elevations. They can withstand the cold, but they don't love, freezing cold weather all the time. So lower elevations is better for them, and then areas near permanent water sources are better. Unlike in California, we find that the black bears in this region are more carnivorous than other black bears. So of course they can eat, berries and nuts and seeds and insects. But the ones down here, prey on wild horses and, take a lot of fish from the rivers and really do a lot of hunting themselves.
That's fascinating. We have a question from the group is, what's the biggest bear that you've seen, perhaps weight-wise even?
Oh, sure. About
largest.
Between 700 and 800 pounds, and that's a black bear, which was many years ago. It wasn't recently. It was about 2013. Again, in Nevada, in the state of Nevada. And although I've done bear work in Nevada and California, in Minnesota and Maryland, in Montana, I've done bear work in a lot of places, but the largest bear I've encountered was in Nevada. It was safe for me. I was working in a team, and we set up a trap, which was a very big cage for this bear. We just put some yummy bait in the trap. It was a can of tuna fish, so very appropriate and smells really good. The bear walks into the cage and eats a tuna fish, and it shuts the door behind it. And that was just long enough for us to sedate the bear, put a collar on him, and then release him back when he was done. But I have some great pictures of that I didn't include here, but it's enormous, enormous black bear that was actually jet black in color, which is rare for that region.
How long or tall, if they were to stand on their hind legs, would a bear like that reach?
Oh, sure. They can be about 6 feet tall or so. Again, grizzly bears can be much bigger, up to 12 feet when they stand up. They don't do a lot of standing. They might do that to kind of just scratch their back and that kind of thing. But bears and dogs have a common ancestor. So no time recently, but if you look way back in evolutionary history, bears and dogs actually came from the same animal ancestor. So there's a lot of behavioral similarities too. So, bears are very quiet animals. They don't make a lot of sounds. But if a bear does make some sounds, it might almost sound like a dog barking.
Oh, interesting. I was going to ask if there was one personality trait of bears that may surprise us, or something about bears that we may not know about regarding their personality that you could share. The barking sounds interesting.
I don't know if it would be surprising, but probably my favorite thing about studying bears is that their main goals in life are to eat as much as possible so that they can then sleep as much as possible. And I can really relate to that myself. It just seems like such a wonderful and simple life, but they spend summer and fall just gorging themselves so that they can sleep for winter into the spring. And it's just like very simple, very straightforward. Sounds like a great life to me. They're also top predators, so they don't have any natural enemies. So they don't have anything to be afraid of. They don't have any worries outside of people. People are the only enemy they might have, but they haven't evolved to understand that. So they live a very stress-free, very peaceful life, and I really enjoy that about them.
It's wonderful. I imagine now we will try to avoid to eat like bears, that we're all sort of working from home, or those of us who avoid the fridge, That's great. And do you do any research with wolves or other dog species, wild dog species in a way, in California or in Nevada?
Yeah, great question. So I do not study wolves. I've never done my own wolf study. I work with people who have. But one of the main, kind of like the theoretical ecology work that comes out of my research is useful for all carnivore species. So, what I'm kind of finding, the patterns and behavioral mechanisms of bears in these landscapes is theoretically useful for tigers in India, or lions in Africa, or sharks, in the Pacific. Carnivores as a group have a lot of behavioral similarities, and a lot of their ecologies fit with each other, kind of like herbivores. There's some people who are herbivore ecologists, and they can study one herbivore species and make claims about the conservation of many of them. So I'm often speaking with wolf experts because a lot of our work overlaps with each other. And also a lot of the challenges are similar too. We're often working in landscapes where people don't want wolves there, and I'm working in landscapes where people don't want bears. And so just kind of dealing with those social challenges, there's a lot of similarities.
And we do have a couple more questions. I think we'll wrap it up soon after these. And we have a cheerleader for theoretical biology, which is great as well, and a question where she says, I also just learned that polar bears don't actually hibernate. Do all other bears hibernate, or do you know why polar bears don't?
Oh yeah, great question. So often people like me and other biologists will talk about bears hibernating as if that is universal. It is really particular to black bears and brown bears in places where resources become scarce in the winter. So it's really important to understand that bears don't have to hibernate. So if you went to the zoo, you aren't going to find hibernating bears in the wintertime. They hibernate when they live in ecosystems where there's nothing to eat in the winter. It's a survival mechanism. So again, if you go to the zoo, or if you go to Florida and the Everglades, there's plenty of black bears there. They don't need to hibernate because there's stuff to eat all year. So that's the same with polar bears, because polar bears are obligate carnivores. There aren't a lot of nuts and berries, you know, in the polar Arctic. And so because of that, they do a lot of hunting. They're hunting for seals, they're hunting for, you know, eggs, other things to eat. That's available all year round. The temperatures definitely dip up there, but they're able to survive with all of their body fat. So other bear species, you know, there's many of them globally. Many of them don't hibernate because they live in tropical ecosystems like sun bears, spectacled bears, you know, et cetera. And then there's my favorite, panda bears that are in China, and they are vegetarians.
That's great. I was just going to ask if of all the species that you've researched, what might be your favorite, and of the species that you haven't researched, is there any that you wish you could and that you hope to in the future?
You know, I do have a favorite animal that I've never studied before, but it is also a carnivore, and that's the bald eagle. And there isn't necessarily a rhyme or reason to why I love bald eagles, but I actually didn't see my first bald eagle until 2017. And I was just driving down the highway. I was in the Adirondacks in upstate New York, and I almost drove off the highway because all of a sudden 2 bald eagles are soaring above me. And it felt like it changed my life. I've always admired birds of prey. I've always thought they're just tremendous and so amazing. And growing up, you know, I grew up in California. I was a child in the early and mid 90s. And that was when there was a lot of messaging about, you know, how endangered eagles were and how, you know, their eggs were super thin because of all these chemicals in the ecosystem. So I remember actually being a child and being really, really worried about bald eagles and that they were going to become extinct. Now they're super abundant. They're not an endangered species. They, you know, you can be in Central Park and see a bald eagle fly over. I mean, they're really everywhere. It took me many years to see one for myself. And they're my favorite. I would be really happy to study birds of prey sometime.
Well, you'll have to come to the Palos Verdes Peninsula area, where on occasion we do get bald eagles that are they're bred in Catalina, or, you know, they build their nests there just on these precipices of the island, and they fly across the channel and disperse through the peninsula area. So it's really fascinating. Meaningful for us too is that there's a nice nexus, I would say, between the research you do and the work that we do here at the Palos Verdes Peninsula Land Conservancy. And, you know, while we don't have black bears or very many large carnivores, the largest we have are coyotes. We also have gray fox. And so we do wildlife tracking programs with community scientists as well to determine where they're located in our natural open space areas, and what they eat and how they move and how our urban environment affects them. As well as our endangered species conservation around the Palos Verdes blue butterflies and also our birds. So I would just take the opportunity to share a little bit of our slides as well. I just have 3 really brief slides to share, and hopefully you can all see this. And but anyway, that just highlighting how rare of an environment we have here on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. The Mediterranean climate is only located in 7 other places around the world, and it really nurtures a biodiverse area. And in the Palos Verdes Peninsula, we have the coast all the way up to the hilltops, but surrounded by the Los Angeles mountains. So you get quite a diverse set of ecosystems that create our California coastal sage scrub community. Really, it's also a place where people like to live. And so there's been a tremendous amount of urban development here in Los Angeles County, leading to 85% loss of this biodiverse coastal sage scrub habitat. So you can imagine that the species that rely on this habitat are really imperiled. And so it's led to a tremendous amount of endangered or threatened species that live in very close proximity to the Los Angeles area. And we have 4 target species that we work to conserve through our habitat restoration and our land conservation work. We have the cactus wren, the gnatcatcher, and our 2 butterflies is the Palos Verdes blue butterfly, which is the most endangered butterfly in North America, and the El Segundo blue butterfly, which only uses these coast buckwheat and clings to the edge of the cliffs here in Palos. So we have a native plant nursery where we propagate the plants that these animals need and they need to survive. And so we welcome volunteers to help us when the time is right to come and help us with our native plant propagation and our plantings in the nature. Here's some resources where you can find out how to help us. Our website is pvplc.org. And you can join us even now during this remote distancing time through our Adopt a Plot program, where volunteers can nurture a piece of land, a plot of land, so to speak, that you can adopt and help us plant native plants and remove invasive plants and take care of them through the summertime. You can also buy native plants to grow in your own backyard, and that's a great way for these animals to disperse from the preserve. And then we also really can only survive on donations, so we appreciate any contributions and your volunteer involvement. I'll stop sharing. I really appreciate you all joining us today. Thank you so much, and we really look forward to being back in touch with you again when in person when the time is right. And until then, you know, be safe and be well. And we wish you a happy belated Earth Day, and we will be in touch with you soon. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.